that I firmly believe that your research should inform your story, not the other way around. I read a lot of books where people have a certain plot in their mind and they try to shoehorn their historical research into it. And I feel like you can tell that that's the case. I usually start researching when I have an idea and nothing more. I have an idea, I know where I want to set it, I know about the time period, though not completely. And then I start researching. And what happens is that the researching begins to inform the story for me. The research for me is a way of brainstorming the plot. So that by the time I get ready to start the story, the research has dictated it to me. It's told me what time period, it's told me where I'm going specifically in it. And I think the important thing to remember is that when you're researching a work of fiction, you need to know not just the historical timeline of the events in your novel, but the lifestyles and the philosophies and the mores of the time. Because if you do that, then you have characters that are deeply rooted in their time, in their attitudes, and everything they do, and the doors that are open and closed for them come from the research. I think these are the questions you have to ask yourself. You know, how did society think of women? What did it think of children, minorities, sex, politics, religion, science? What kind of entertainment was available? What kind of schooling did they have? And what kind of education did most people have? You know, what were people talking about? What was going on economically? You know, depressions and recessions impact the way people feel and the way they live radically. And I think these cultural touchstones aren't just casual references, they influence the way people think. And in order to, they enable you to really get into the heads of your characters. And, you know, for me, stories come from questions that I have to ask. They come from reading between the lines of the sources that I read, which means that you kind of have to know something about the period you're dealing with in order to know when to read between the lines. For example, if you're reading the journal or the diary of a woman who's a servant who gets suddenly let go, you should know enough about the period to try to read between the lines, because servants were extremely hard to keep and to get. And there's no wife in, say, New York City who's going to let a servant just go unless something pretty radical has happened. So these are the kinds of things that you need to know sort of going in, so that you can see when there's a mystery, when there's something that you can read between the lines for. For example, when I was doing research on the Great Seattle Fire for my novel City of Ash, the reason I started writing that novel actually was because I was at the underground tour with my daughters, and they said that after the fire, almost within a day, they had raised a relief tent for the men to stay in. Well, the fire knocked out the entire business quarter of Seattle, and not just the business quarter, but the Sin District, and almost every boarding house. And there were plenty of women, so where did they go? I mean, they couldn't go anywhere. The wharves burnt, the railroad tracks were twisted, they were stuck in town, yet there was no mention in the historical record of where these women had stayed. And that was the question that sent me on this course. We're like, I have to know the answer to this. You know, I eventually found out, it was in the caption of a picture of the armor, said that women had been put up there, but not till 3 days after the fire. So they were just living on the streets to them. And that was only in a caption, no place else mentioned it. So see, this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. And I think as a historical writer, you need to know you need to present for your reader a world that is familiar but also foreign at the same time. Which means you don't just inundate somebody with detail, you weave it in with your character's emotional reactions to it. You want to bring out sort of bits, and bring it out bits and pieces, weave it through. Don't forget your your objective. You are not a historian, you are a storyteller. So the history should be informing your story, and the detail should be making it come alive. But the moment you start to get into, well, the detail, the step-by-step street maps, for example, or, you know, if you're telling me exactly how to get to the Tower of London, your reader is going to be bored. So you don't want to do that. You need to always ask yourself, is this information important? Does it move the story forward? Am I boring my reader? You may be fascinated about, you know, every step and every corner that someone turns getting around in 19th century Seattle, but I can guarantee your reader is not. You know, particularly if they're not from Seattle. You want to give them the flavor of the period without overwhelming them. For example, in describing a room, you can safely assume when you say a bedroom that most people know what's going to be in a bedroom. A bed's going to be there, probably a dresser, maybe a wardrobe, whatever. But what you're trying to do is to present the things that are not usual. The things in a room that aren't what someone might expect. The things that give people a clue into who your character is. And then you need to have your character have an emotional response to that. And that's how you make sort of the historical research in your stories come alive without it being overwhelming and without it being boring, which is the biggest problem. I think now it's your turn, actually.